The creek country on the west side of Cade County is nothing like the flat wheat ground out east. It is low-rolling bottomland where Salt Creek and its little feeder branches wander through in no hurry at all. And the best of that ground is the black meadow bottom along the water, hay ground and pasture that a man can count on when the uplands burn brown in July. And by the summer, this story starts. Nearly every low wet spot in that whole creek country had been dug out and drained and ditched and turned into crop ground, every soft place tiled, and every slough dredged, and every seep run off down a straight-cut ditch to the creek. So that ground that had lain in cattails and sedge and standing water since before the county had a name was plowed black. And planted to corn, every wet acre made to pay, every low place but one. Orpha Lund farmed the old Lund bottom on the south bend of Salt Creek, 160 acres of the best black meadow in the creek country, and square in the middle of her best hay ground lay a wide crooked slough near 12 acres of it, a shallow marsh of cattail and bulrush, and open black water grown round with willow. Wet the year round, even in a dry August, and she would not drain it, would not let a dredge touch it, would not tile the seeps that fed it, nor cut the willows that ringed it. 12 acres of the finest bottomland in the county given over to frogs and red-winged blackbirds and standing water in a time when good hay ground rented dear and every other low spot on that side of the county had been made to grow corn. Cleon Hasker farmed the two bottoms just downstream of her, drained clean and tiled tight, every foot of his creek ground in tall corn to the water's edge, and Cleon stood in the shade of the feed store one August afternoon and said it, the way it got said for years after, not cruel, just certain, that the widow Lund was the only farmer he ever knew who kept 12 acres of black-bottom dirt as a duck pond, that a man could run cattle on that slough all summer and cut 2 crops of hay off it, besides if she would only let a ditch into it, and that if stubbornness put up hay old Orpha would fill every barn in the creek country by herself. The men in the feed store shade laughed, and Cleon's boy Merle, who ran their big dragline ditcher for hire all over that side of the county, took to calling the Lund bottom the frog farm, and the name went round the way names do, and men driving the creek road past that shaggy green ring of willows in a country dug dry and planted fence-a-row to fence-a-row would shake their heads at good bottom wasted, and for a good many summers the creek country only laughed. 2 summers later, on the worst afternoon of the driest year that side of the county had seen since the dust years, those same men would drive down Orpha Lund's rutted lane 1 truck at a time to stand at her gate with their hats in their hands and ask her to let their thirsty cattle down to her slow for water, and Cleon Hasker, whose own drilled well, and whose creek both stood bone-dry that August, would be the last one down the lane and the one who stayed the longest. Now you have to understand what a wet year and a dry year do to the water under the ground, because the whole of this story sits on that one thing, and most of the creek country had plumb forgotten it, the way you forget a thing that has not pinched you in a while. The water in a creek is not the story. The water you can see, the water running in Salt Creek and standing in the sloughs and lying in the stock ponds, is only the little top edge of the real water, and the real water is under the ground, down in the sand and gravel below the black dirt, and it is called the water table, and it is the whole savings account of a whole countryside. A well does not make water, a well only reaches down and dips it out of that underground store, and a spring is only a place where that underground water brims up on its own, and the plain hard fact about that buried water is the fact the creek country had forgotten, that it has to be put back. That every gallon a dry summer pulls up out of a well, and every gallon the corn drinks and the sun cooks off has to be soaked back down into the ground in the wet part of the year, or the store runs down, and the only way it ever goes back down is slow. Water standing on the land long enough to soak, and the one thing on God's earth that holds water on the land long enough to soak it down is a marsh. And here is the thing about water on flat, wet bottomland that most folks had stopped thinking about. When the snow melts in March and the big spring rains come, a terrible lot of water tries to move at once, and if that water finds a straight dug ditch and a tiled field, it runs off fast, Off your bottom and into the creek and down the creek and clean out of the county in 3 days. Gone downstream to flood somebody else and never once soaking in, but if that same water spreads out wide and shallow across a marsh full of cattail and sedge, it stops there, it stands, and it soaks. Days and weeks of it lying quiet on the black ground and sinking down grain by grain into the sand below, filling the buried store back up. And the slow works like the neck of a funnel turned the slow way, catching the fast spring water and letting it down into the ground a little at a time all summer long. So that a marsh is not wasted water lying idle. A marsh is the one place in the whole watershed where the underground savings account actually gets its deposit. There is exactly one cheap thing that keeps the wells full through a dry year, and it has been known and forgotten and known again for as long as men have farmed wet country, and it is standing water let alone. A slough does not just hold its own 12 acres wet. The water it soaks down spreads out sideways underground far past its own willows. It lifts the whole water table under the fields around it, it feeds the springs down the draw, and keeps the little branches running in August, and keeps every neighbor's well within a mile of it, that much nearer the top of the ground, so that one shaggy crooked marsh in the middle of a bottom is quietly watering half a township from below. And there is more to it than that, because the same marsh that recharges the ground in spring also gives its water back slow in the dry months, brimming its seeps and holding the creek up and keeping the bottom grass green 3 weeks longer than the uplands, and every bit of that had been worked out and watched and written down by men who had farmed wet country before and seen it go dry, and none of it was secret. And the whole creek country had ditched and drained and tiled its way out of it 1 wet acre at a time. Because a marsh does not raise a crop, and the water table does not show on any deed, and no banker ever once asked a man at renewal time how full the ground was under his feet. Because here is what had happened in the creek country in the 15 years before, and there was no meanness in any of it, only arithmetic. Corn was high, and the drainage men had come through with their big drag lines and their tile plows, and the county drainage district had cut the main ditch deeper and straighter, and the arithmetic said, drain. A wet acre grows nothing, and a drained acre grows 100 bushels, and the whole creek country did the arithmetic together. And the dredges came, and for 15 summers running you could stand on the creek road and watch a new straight ditch cut across another bottom, the old sloughs pulled down and dried out and broke to corn a marsh at a time. The water hustled off the land as fast as a man could dig a channel to carry it, and the creek country had never grown more corn in its life than it did in those years. And the whole time, the way a man draws his savings down a little a year and calls it wages, the creek country was spending its buried water. They had been lucky in the weather. That was the part nobody said out loud. A run of kind wet years with rain enough that no dry spell ever caught the ground drawn down and the sloughs all gone at the same time. And luck that holds long enough quits being called luck. It starts being called the way things are now. And any farmer who kept on like the dry years were real, keeping his low ground wet and his marsh undrained, quit looking careful to his neighbors and started looking backward. And then started looking foolish, and that is the exact spot Orpha Lund stood in for a good many years. A spare, straight-backed widow keeping 12 acres of cattail in the middle of the best bottom in the creek country, the frog farm. The last low place on that side of the county the dredges had never touched. But here is what Orpha Lund was actually doing with that slough, season by season, and it is the thing not one man in the feed store shade could see from the road. The marsh was not neglect, whatever it looked like driving past. It was kept, the way you keep a thing you understand the worth of. She kept the willows ringed round it so the banks held and the water stayed cool and did not cut away. And she kept a few head of cattle to graze the sedge meadow at its edge, but never let them break down into the soft heart of it, and she cleaned the beaver out when they dammed the outlet too high and threatened to drown her hay, but she never once let a ditch be cut to lower it. Because a marsh with a ditch through it is not a marsh anymore, the water finds the cut and runs for the creek, and the whole soaking work of the thing quits in a single season. And she knew the way the water came into it from 3 low seeps at the upper end and the way it left slow over a wide grassed sill at the lower end. And she had her hay ground laid out around it so that the black meadow drank from the edges of it all summer while the uplands baked. That was the first thing. The second thing was the way she kept the whole bottom, and it was the thing that looked backward to a county that liked a field drained bone dry and worked black to the water's edge, because Orpha Lund never in her life hurried water off her land. Where her neighbors cut straight ditches, she left the little branches crooked and grassed and let them wander, so the water walked slow across her ground and had time to soak. And where her neighbors tiled their seeps dry, she left hers running into the sedge. And she kept her creek bank in a wide strip of grass and willow instead of plowing to the lip of it, so that in a big rain her bottom held the water and let it down easy, while the drained bottoms downstream shed it all at once. And the men on the creek road had a word for how her ground looked, boggy and rough and only half farmed, and Orpha took it the way she took most things, quiet. Because the bog they were pointing at was her water going into the bank where she could draw on it in a dry year. And the third thing was the springs. Down the draw below the slough, where the ground fell away toward the creek, Orpha had 3 little springs that ran cold and steady all summer long out of the foot of that recharged ground. And she had walled them up with native stone and kept them clean and piped one of them to a stone tank in her lower lot, and her cattle watered at that spring tank in the hottest, driest August of any year and never wanted. And folks who saw it thought she was only lucky in her springs. And she let them think it. Because there is no arguing a man into seeing that his neighbor's springs run, because his neighbor kept the marsh that fed them, and she kept the tanks full and said little. The reason she kept the marsh at all was named Emmett Lund, and he had been dead 9 years. Emmett was her husband, and Emmett Lund had grown up on that bottom and farmed it his whole life, and he had lived through the dust years on that ground as a young man. The dry years when the whole mid-country blew and cracked and the wells went down and down, and Emmett had watched in those years what happened to the neighbors who had already drained their low ground, watched their wells quit while the Lund springs ran on, because the old Lund slough had been holding that bottom's water up out of sight the whole time, and Emmett's own father had made him promise it, standing at the edge of that marsh in the middle of the dry years with the creek gone to a string of puddles, that whatever corn was worth, and whatever the drainage men said, he would never cut a ditch into that slough as long as he owned the ground, that a family could always buy hay in a dry year, but it could not buy water, and the last thing of any account Emmett ever said to Orpha, said the winter he was dying with the whole creek country already 15 years into its ditching, was the law the rest of this story runs on, that the wet ground is not wasted ground. It is the ground keeping all the rest of it alive, and the day you drain the last of it is the day the country starts to go dry from underneath, and nobody sees it happen till the wells quit. Orpha had buried him and gone on alone, a childless widow of 50 some years farming the bottom by herself with hired help at haying. And the creek country had forgotten the dry years the way a man forgets a broke leg, and she had not, because she had married into a family that carried the memory the way other families carried a Bible, and that is the whole difference this story turns on. She did not carry it entirely alone those last summers, and the help came from a direction nobody would have picked. Sella Voss was 24 years old and renting the little upland place a mile above the Lund bottom, farming it alone after her father died owing on it, the only young woman working her own ground on that side of the county. And the same men who called Orpha's place the Frog Farm gave Sella a year, 2 at the most, and said it kindly, and were kind men, and were wrong. She came down to the Lund bottom the first time to buy hay in a short year, and she saw the slough and the crooked grassed branches and the walled springs running full in August, and she did not laugh. She asked questions, and they were good questions, and Orpha answered every one of them the way she would have answered a neighbor of 40 years. And by the second visit, the 2 of them were walking the bottom together, and what Orpha told her was plain, that Sella's rented upland had been tiled and ditched dry by the man who owned it before, and her one drilled well was already slow in a dry August, because the whole slope above the creek had been drained out from under her, and she could not put back the county's water in one summer. But she could quit hurrying her own water off. She could leave her draws grassed and crooked instead of cutting them straight. She could dig a shallow pond in her lower draw and let it hold the spring runoff and soak it instead of shedding it. She could fence her stock off the one wet seep she had left and let it heal and spread. And Sella Voss did every one of those things that very year. The only ground on the creek side besides the Lund bottom that went into that dry stretch trying to keep its water instead of racing it to the creek, and down at the feed store they said old Orpha had finally found somebody green enough to take her seriously. And Merle Hasker said the frog farm was breeding, and Sella heard it and dug her pond anyway, which at 24. With one mortgaged place and no family and every man in the shade watching her fail, is a good deal harder than it sounds. The county's waterman came out that same dry fall. A quiet fellow named Tobe Gans who drilled wells and tested them all over Cade County and knew the underground water better than any man alive on that side, and he spent a whole afternoon on the Lund bottom with his tape and his sounding line, dropping his line down the old dug wells and the springs and reading how far down the water stood. And what he found, he told Orpha straight at her kitchen door, that the water table under her bottom stood higher in that dry fall than under any ground in the creek country, 4 and 5 feet nearer the top than under the drained bottoms a mile off, that her slough had been quietly banking water into the ground under her whole farm and a good ways past it for as long as she had kept it. While out on the ditched bottoms the water had been dropping a little every dry year for 15 years, with nobody watching the buried number. And then he told her the honest hard thing too, because that was the kind of man he was, that none of it showed up at the crib come fall, that Cleon Hasker's drained bottoms had out-yielded and outgrossed the Lund place 2 falls out of 3 and would go right on doing it in any wet year. Because Orpha was carrying 12 acres of marsh off the tax, paying rolls of her own pocket and farming the rest of her bottom gentler than it would stand, and that by every number the bank or the crib ever looked at, the drained farmers were beating her, and it was not close. Orpha asked him one question. She asked whether Tobe Gans had ever set a well pump in a year when it had not rained enough in 2 springs running to fill the ground back up, and Tobe stood quiet a minute and said no, that the weather had been kind the whole time he had been drilling that country, and that when he thought about all those drained bottoms in a real dry year with the water already drawn down under them, he did not much care for his own thoughts. Orpha said her slough was not kept against the wet years, and that a man beating you 2 falls out of 3 by spending water he is not putting back is not ahead of you. He has only not been billed yet, and Tobe Gans wrote that down in his book, word for word, and did not argue. Now understand what kind of weather came on, because the sky set the trap with all the patience in the world, and the creek country walked into it thanking heaven for the dry hay weather. It came on dry in the spring, a thin snowmelt and a light spring rain so that the ground never really filled, and it stayed dry through a summer that anybody with sense could see was wrong, week after week of hot clear wind and no rain to speak of, and the drained bottoms drank their tile dry ground down, and the corn rolled its leaves in July, and men stood in the feed store shade and said it would rain. It always rained, and the fall came dry too, and the next spring came on dry behind it, the second dry spring running, and now there was no wet year to feel the ground back, and the buried store had nothing coming in, and a hole thirsty country pulling out of it, and by the middle of that second dry summer the creek country lay in exactly the shape the arithmetic had been digging toward for 15 years, every slough drained, and every seep tiled, and every drop of 2 springs rain long since run off down the straight ditches to the creek and gone, the water table pulled down under the whole side of the county lower than the oldest man could remember, and the country lay there under a hard white sky waiting for one thing, and that August it came. Not a storm, but the plain, slow lack of one, the dry finally reaching all the way down to the water. The creek went first. Salt Creek quit running in July and lay in a string of green, shrinking puddles by the 1st of August, and then the puddles went too, and the creek bed lay cracked and white in the sun, and men who had drained their bottoms so the creek would carry their water off now stood and looked at a creek that had no water to carry, because a creek in dry weather does not run on rain, it runs on the ground brimming up into it, and the ground had nothing left to give. Then the stock ponds went, the shallow dug ponds that half the bottoms watered cattle out of, dried to cracked mud with the cattle bawling around the rim, and then, one after another down that side of the county, the wells began to fail. First the old shallow dug wells, and then the drilled ones. The water dropping below the foot valve, so the pumps sucked air. And it did in one dry August what no hail and no flood had ever done to that country. Because hail takes a crop and a flood takes a crop, but the dry going all the way to the water table was taking the one thing a family cannot haul in or plant again. And there was not one thing a man on those drained bottoms could do but stand at a dry well and watch 15 years of hurried-off water refuse to be there when he finally needed a drink of it. And it did not fail all at once, which was somehow the worst of it. It failed a farm at a time down the creek in a slow, ugly order that told the whole story to anybody willing to read it, because the wells that quit first were the ones on the ground, drained the longest and the hardest, the bottoms where the tile ran thickest and the ditches ran straightest, and a man could have stood on the creek road with a map of the drainage district in his hand and called out ahead of time whose pump would suck air next. First the two Hasker bottoms that had been dredged deepest, then the tile flats below them, the well failing on the very farms that had grown the most corn in the fat years. And men who had never once in their lives thought about the ground below the ground now drove miles to haul drinking water in milk cans and stood their cattle at the edge of a dry pond and could not for the life of them say when the water had gone, because it had not gone in the drought, it had gone a little every dry spell for 15 years down the ditches they had dug with their own money, and the drought had only come along at last and shown them the empty account. Understand what those dry weeks carried off, because the drought is not the story, the drought is only the bill coming due. A crop is 1 year, you lose it, and you plant again, but the water under the ground is every wet year at once, all the deposits there ever were. And the water that was not there that August was not that summer's rain that had never come. It was the 15 springs of runoff that had been hustled off down the ditches instead of soaked into the ground. And when the dry finally reached bottom, the drained side of the county found its buried savings account overdrawn. The wells dry, the ponds dry, the creek dry. The corn burnt to nothing on the very bottoms that had been drained to grow it, and where a man had drained his low ground hardest and tiled it tightest, there his water was gonest, because he had spent the very ground that would have held it. And in the middle of the marsh that whole dry August the water lay. This is the part men told for years after, and it needs no polishing. The same drought that dried the creek to white-cracked mud came up against 12 acres of slough that had been soaking water into the ground for a lifetime. And the marsh drew down and shrank in its willows, but it did not go dry. And the ground under the whole Lund bottom, brimmed full year on year from that slough, stood higher than the dry that August could reach. So that Orphalund's 3-walled springs ran on cold and steady down the draw when every drilled well within 3 miles of them was sucking air, and her stone stock tank stayed full, and her bottom hay stood green along the marsh edges when the uplands were burnt to powder, and the Lund cattle watered, and the Lund hay got put up in a summer that put up almost no hay on that whole side of the county. And the slough did one thing more. A thing Emmett Lund had said out loud years before and been laughed at for down at the feed store. It watered the neighbors when they had nowhere else to turn. All that dry August the cattle on the drained bottoms had no water, and one by one their owners came. Because a marsh drawn low is still a marsh full of water next to a dry creek and a dry pond, and Orpha Lund opened her gate and let their thirsty cattle down a fenced lane to drink at the edge of her slough, herd after herd, watering half the creek country's stock out of the 12 acres they had all laughed at, and the first man in the county to say the thing out loud, before the drought had even broke, was Merle Hasker, who drove his father's dry-mouthed cattle down the Lund lane himself and stood at the edge of that shrinking marsh watching them wade in and drink, and said at the supper table that night, to nobody in particular, that the frogs had more water this evening than the whole rest of the creek country put together. Tobe Gans said his piece first, because it was his job to drive that whole dry side of the county sounding dead wells and looking at what the country had done to itself, and he made no ceremony of it. He stood at Orphalund's kitchen door and said he had told her in the fall that the drained farmers were beating her and it was not close, and that he had been wrong in the only year that would ever matter, and he wanted it written in his own book, in his own hand. And then he asked her the question his job required him to ask, which was whether Orpha would stand at the edge of that slough with him and say all of it, the marsh and the crooked-grassed branches and the walled springs and the water let alone, to whatever part of the creek country could be got to come. Because the county was going to have to learn to hold its water now, all of it, the way a man swears off drink in the hospital. And it would go crooked and half done unless somebody who had held her water right stood up and showed how. Orpha said she would, provided nobody expected her to gloat about it. Cleon Hasker took 11 days. He was a proud man with the 2 most thoroughly drained bottoms in the creek country and a boy watching him to learn what a man does when he has been wrong out loud for years. And both of those things weighed on him the whole 11 days, and the morning he finally came he sat in his truck at the head of the Lund Lane a long while first, and Orpha saw him down there and let him sit, because she had watched Cleon Hasker coming for a good many summers the way you watch weather build. And when he finally stood at her gate with his hat in his hands, he did not soften it or excuse it. He said he had come to ask 2 things. First, that she let his cattle down to water like the rest, and second, that she show him how a man puts water back into ground he had spent 15 years teaching to shed it, and that he had stood in that feed store shade and called the soundest farming on the creek side a frog farm and a duck pond, and had dredged and tiled every low place he owned for corn, low ground his own father had left in slough on purpose, and that whatever it took to learn better, saying this much out loud had cost him more, and Orpha took him down to the slough and did not make it easy nor hard, only quiet. She let his cattle water, and she would not take a dime for it, and it was not softness, and Cleon knew it. It was the marsh finally doing the one thing a lifetime of keeping it had kept it to do. She walked him up the draw and showed him the walled springs running, and she told him plain that he could not undrain his bottoms in 1 year and could not dig back the county's water alone, but he could quit hurrying every drop off his place. He could dam his straight ditches back into shallow ponds and let them soak. He could leave a low corner or 2 go back to marsh. He could grass his creek bank wide again and let his tiled seeps run. And more than any single thing, she gave him the working rule for the long, slow years it would take the ground to fill back, that a farmer holds his water the way he holds his soil, by quitting the habit of racing it away, that the ponds and the marsh are the bank, but the whole way you farm the bottom is whether you are making deposits or only withdrawals, and that a man can start putting water back the very next wet spring if he will only quit farming like the dry years died with his father. Cleon Hasker did all of it over the years that came after, and did it the way converted men do things, all the way, and his bottoms came back to holding water a wet spring at a time. And the 2 of them were not friends exactly. They were the thing creek country respects more, neighbors who had settled it, and the first spring his rebuilt lower pond stood full and soaking he stopped his truck at the head of the Lund Lane and lifted 2 fingers off the wheel, and that was the whole of it, and both of them counted it enough. Sella Voss came through that drought on her little upland place like the Lund bottom did, small as her start had been. Her grassed draws had held what rain there was, and her new shallow pond had soaked instead of shed, and her one healing seep had spread, and her drilled well, slow as it was, never quite quit while deeper wells on drained ground all around her went dry. And the man who owned her rented place drove out, looked at a well still making water on ground everybody had written off, and sold her the place on terms a young woman could carry, and it went round the feed store inside a month exactly whose ways she had been farming by. And the men in the shade quit giving Sella Voss 1 more year, and a few of them, that same fall, were standing at the edge of Orphalund's slough themselves with their hats in their hands, asking the widow how a body starts to put the water back. Because that is how it spread. Orpha and Tob Gan stood at the edge of that slough one September and said the whole of it to better than 100 farmers from up and down the creek, and Orpha Lund, who had not made 3 public remarks in 20 years, stood on the tailgate of a truck in the hot, dry wind and said that nothing she had done was clever, that keeping the marsh was not her idea. It was a promise a dying man had made his son at the edge of that same water in a dry year already gone by, and that the country had not been struck down by weather. It had been billed for its bookkeeping drop by drop for 15 years. And that a marsh is not a duck pond. A marsh is the county's water in the bank. And the ways to hold water went up and down that creek from that year on, farmer to farmer, dammed ditch by grassed draw by low corner, let back to slough, and with every farm that took it up the water under that side of the county stopped its long fall a little, and Tob Gan sounded the wells for years after and watched the buried number quit dropping and slowly, wet spring by wet spring, begin to come back. The slough never left the Lund bottom. That was the part the country came to prize most, that the 12 acres of cattail, a whole creek township, had grinned it lay right where it had always lain, and Orpha Lund never let 1 foot of ditch into it as long as she lived. Not in the best corn year, not ever. And the place never once outgrossed the big drained operators in a wet year, and never would. And Orpha would tell you so herself. Flat. And every dry August after, when the creek ran thin and the country held its breath a little, the way it always would now. The bottoms up and down Salt Creek lay dotted with soaking ponds and healing low corners and wide-grassed banks, and the wells held where they had once gone dry, and every bit of it traced back to 12 acres of marsh on a place the county had called the Frog Farm. And nobody called it that anymore, and the men who once had were the ones who saw to it that nobody did. If you have stayed with her this far, you already know this was never about a marsh. Orpha Lund is the reason the creek side of that county still has water in a dry year, and she never made but the one speech about it. And she never once said "I told you so" to a single man who had laughed at her, and to the end of her days she would tell you she had not been wise, she had only married a man honest enough to keep a promise made at the edge of a slough in a dry year, and she had simply declined, for the length of a widowhood, to make her husband a liar. She was laughed at for years by good men who were not cruel, only certain, and she was proven right in one dry August by a drought that did not care about any of them, and in between she did nothing but keep the willows on her banks, and the water in her marsh, and the springs walled clean, and let the arithmetic call her a fool every fall at the crib. That is all stewardship ever is. It is the small, unpaid thing, done the plain, slow, careful way, every season it is due, for a lifetime, so that in the one dry year that matters your ground still has water in it while the whole country stands at a dead pump. So tell me which one you would have been in that feed store shade in the wet fat years. There were only 2 kinds of farmer on that creek, and neither kind was a bad man. The ones who looked at 12 acres of cattail in the middle of Black Bottom and saw a stubborn widow throwing away the best hay ground in the county. And the one who looked at that same shaggy ring of willows and saw the only water on that side of the county that would still be there the dry August nobody had come to yet. Be honest about it. Most of us are the first kind, and the first kind is not stupid, it is only certain, and certain is the most expensive thing a person can be. Write down in the comments which one you were, and tell me what part of the country you are reading this from tonight, because I read every one of them and I like knowing where you all are sitting. Next time, I want to tell you about a man over in the sand hills on the north edge of that same county who would not break out the rough grass on his blowing sand ground, no matter how his neighbors plowed theirs to potatoes. And what those neighbors came to ask him the year the sand began to move. And if this one got to you, send it on to somebody who has been told that the old careful way they do a thing, the slow way, the way that gives up a little every year to be sure, is a foolish waste of good ground. Down on the south bend of Salt Creek, an hour before dark, A spare, straight-backed old woman in a faded barn coat walks the willow edge of her slough with a spade over her shoulder, and she stops where a runlet of high water has begun to cut a little channel toward the creek. A small thing, nothing a man driving the road would ever see, and she turns a few spades of black sod into the cut and firms it down with her boot, and closes it. One more year.